Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Cleveland, and I'm a paralegal here at Lyles Parker. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Texas Association for Home Care and Hospice. Today's webinar is entitled Limited English Proficiency Requirements. What does this mean for your agency? Today's presenters are Heidi Kocher and Gunnar Jurgensen. Heidi Kocher, Esquire, MBA, CHC, is a partner at Lyles Parker. She has over 20 years of experience advising and defending healthcare clients on legal and regulatory matters affecting providers of all sizes. She's an expert in all aspects of compliance and privacy programs, including developing and deploying policies, procedures, and training. Her experience includes serving as Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Privacy Officer, implementing the various requirements and aspects of corporate integrity agreements, and responding to and defending audits for Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurers up through the ALJ level. She received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center and is licensed in Texas and Maryland, and she is certified in healthcare compliance. Gunnar Jurgensen, JD, CPC, is a graduate of William & Mary Law School. He represents home health and hospice providers around the country, mostly in connection with administrative audits. And for our audience today, if you guys have any questions throughout the webinar, please do not hesitate to put those in the chat. Thank you so much, and without further ado, I present your speakers, Heidi and Gunnar.
Thank you, Anne. Really appreciate that kind intro, and welcome to our audience today. For those of you in Texas, it is really chilly, and stay warm and stay dry, and hopefully our weather will get better sooner. Next slide, please. One of the things that I do want to say before we dive into this is we have a lot of information on these slides. We may not cover all slides in detail, but the information is on the slides, and it is there for you to read later on at your own convenience. Also, a quick disclaimer, of course, this webinar is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute a legal advice, and it does not create an attorney-client relationship with any of the audience member. If you have specific legal questions, you need to check with your legal counsel and attorneys, because different facts can lead to different outcomes. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into the webinar. Gunnar, do you want to take it away?
Gladly. And just to reiterate, thank you all for joining us today to discuss the limited English proficiency requirements and how it affects your agency, and hopefully get some steps in to develop a constructive plan going forward. Today we're going to be discussing, just to give a brief outline of the presentation today, we're going to talk about the current landscape of linguistic diversity in the United States, the trends, the growing need for greater access to language programs and mechanisms to provide language services to patients. We will discuss the goals of the LEP programs and services, the legal background and framework, the terminology, essentially what really is limited English proficiency, and who exactly is covered by these requirements. We will discuss the obligations and the four-factor test used to determine exactly what those obligations are, because it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It's very dependent on your practice, your geography, as well as just the number of patients that you see and the resources you have at your disposal. We will then discuss the best practices, written translations, and oral interpretations. Those are two separate means of providing these language services, and we will go more into detail on those specific considerations that providers need to take into account. Then there'll be a brief discussion on prior enforcement of LEP obligations by the Office of Civil Rights, and a little discussion of those who were found not to be in compliance, and hopefully learning from their mistakes and implementing your own plans going forward. And then from there, we will move on to an effective LEP implementation plan, sort of borrowing from those other examples that will be discussed before then, and then finish up with additional resources that you can use going forward that can help you map out the best program for you and your practice. And hopefully there'll be some time to answer some questions. A lot of material, so try to get through it while also covering it in depth. All right, so the current landscape of the United States is diverse as ever. There's a growing number of individuals in the country who speak a language other than English, especially those who speak English as a second language. As the slide says, as of 2018, 67.3 million US residents speak language other than English at home. This number has tripled since 1980. The immigration trends are only increasing, especially from the Central and Middle America regions, as well as South America, and honestly all over the globe. We've been seeing migration trends that are just increasing, bringing a lot more cultural diversity as well as language diversity. States with the largest numbers of persons speaking a foreign language are California, Texas, New Mexico, New Jersey. Texas, for the sake of today, obviously a major focus point, and that's why this presentation today is very important. So the LEP program was designed to ensure fair access to government resources and funding, especially in the healthcare space, as well as to foster a cultural clarification between individuals from outside the United States and the providers here in the United States. As we know, different cultures view medicine in different ways or feel comfortable discussing various healthcare needs in different ways. So it's important that there's some degree of communication and mutual understanding, which the LEP programs hope to address and foster. So on the efficiency note, there's a huge emphasis on the lack of language resources leading to a hindrance in beneficial care for individuals who are not proficient in English. This can be from avoiding preventative care, going to see the doctor out of fear that they might be judged or not receive the direct and personal connection with the provider who doesn't speak whatever native language it is that they're speaking. There are longer hospital stays when professional interpreters are not used in admission and discharge. There's a greater risk of surgical infections. There's a greater risk of surgical delays due to difficulty understanding instructions. That goes for post-op as well. If an individual doesn't understand the instructions being given to them after they have a surgery, it's more likely that they won't actually follow those instructions because obviously there's lack of understanding there. There's a greater chance of readmissions for certain chronic conditions due to the difficulty of understanding how to manage these conditions. So again, from the front end, it's about making patients feel comfortable with their providers and feeling that they are able to go to a doctor, or in this case, go to a home health or hospice agency and receive the care that they need and require without feeling stigmatized or as if they can't actually have their needs heard or met. And ultimately, that fosters the efficiency of government-funded healthcare programs. So the basis for the limited English proficiency program it's based in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which provides no person shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this is not to get too into the legalese, but it's a more broadly written provision that applies to essentially all government-funded assistance. So that could be education, healthcare, homeland security. It really runs the gamut. But the first case that really emphasized and applied this provision was in 1974 in the San Francisco area. It's Lau v. Nichols. This was a case where the San Francisco public schools were not providing individuals who spoke Chinese as a first language with language resources, which the Supreme Court determined to be a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, based on these individuals not being able to share in the benefits of that federal assistance. That was determined not providing those language resources amounted to discrimination on the basis of national origin. So that's really the groundwork that we're working with. But for purposes of today and of recent actions, the main emphasis has been on the healthcare industry and providing healthcare resources to those who have limited English proficiency. In 2000, there was an executive order issued by the Bush administration that required limited English proficiency guidance be provided to recipients of federal healthcare funding. So this would be those who are in contracts with HHS, CMS, all of the federally funded healthcare providers. And this was sort of fairly toothless, if from my understanding and my reading of things. But then in 2010, upon the passage of the Affordable Care Act, covered entities, which would be providers with 15 employees or more, are required to take reasonable steps, keyword reasonable steps, to provide meaningful access to each individual with limited English proficiency. And that's based on those individuals that they served and that they would encounter in their administration of healthcare programs and activities. And also as an aside, the Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which is the focus of today's limited English proficiency criteria and requirements, added sex as a protected class when it comes to the administration of healthcare. That obviously is incredibly important for purposes of this discussion today, but it did essentially create more teeth to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and provided more of a enforcement mechanism, which we will discuss. So Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act requires providers who receive federal financial assistance to provide reasonable, meaningful access to individuals with limited English proficiency. Now, it's a little redundant, but I really want to get that emphasized in the open. This includes providing notice of non-discrimination policies and access to language resources in the 15 most commonly spoken languages of that state. Now, as we're going to discuss later on, this requirement might vary depending on the very geography of those that you serve. Not every area is the same. Some areas have languages that are spoken just in that area and not anywhere else in the state. So it's a little more nuanced and gray than this backup, but this is just, again, the legal background and framework. It encourages covered entities, those who are recipients of federally funded healthcare funds, federally funded providers, in other words, are encouraged to develop and implement a language access plan. And this is important in showing your compliance with these requirements and the program itself. This became immediately effective upon the passage of the ACA in 2010. And the enforcement arm of these provisions is the Office of Civil Rights, which provides individuals, not just the Office of Civil Rights, with a civil cause of action for those who violate these provisions and who essentially violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And important to note is which I think we will discuss in the next slide, is this rule it's implemented through the Affordable Care Act, but each administration is tasked with providing the rule and regulation on exactly how to implement the non-discrimination practice and language requirements. So as you can see from the dates of these final rulemakings, revised rules, and new rules, it really changes based on the administration that's in charge. So it looks like, we had the first original rule that came out in 2013 under the Obama administration. You fast forward to May 2016, which is when that went into effect. And the Trump administration issued theirs in June 19th of 2020. And now there's a new rule, new proposed rule that's coming out in 2022. So it's important going forward or 2023. It was proposed in 2022, but will be going into effect in 2023. So it's really important to keep an eye out for those changes in administration, as they are the ones who have the authority under Section 1557 to actually create and establish new rules and new requirements for federally funded providers. So what exactly is limited English proficiency? Essentially, it's those whose primary language is not English, or who have a limited ability to speak, understand, or read, write in English. There might be, it's even those, so if you could be conversational in English, but it's not a language that you have mastery in, or one that you could have a conversation with your provider and fully understand exactly what it is those instructions are. Example of populations likely to include LEP persons that encounter the healthcare system, and specifically hospice, are family members, spouses, and legal guardians of the patients.
And let me just jump in here as well and clarify that this is not limited to spoken language. So the primary language is not English, means spoken English. So somebody who has limited English proficiency might actually include somebody who is deaf and can only sign in American Sign Language or another country's sign language. So just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Heidi. My apologies for missing out on that. That's a major consideration factor. And so recipients, for the purposes of Section 1557 and the LEP programs, these are just those who are healthcare providers receiving federal funding, whether that be participation in CHIP, which is the military insurance, recipients of Medicare Part A, hospitals, skilled nursing facilities, hospices, so very important for our purposes here today. Those who accept Medicare Advantage plans, and human or social service agencies. So if your agency contracts out with a social service provider, it's important that they are also in the loop and in compliance with these provisions as well. So to walk through the obligations, as I said before, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There is a 4-factor test that's recommended by DHS to actually understand what it is that's required of you to be quote-unquote in compliance. So the 4 factors we look to are the number or proportion of limited English proficiency persons eligible to be served or likely to be encountered by the program, the frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with the program, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program to the people's lives, and the resources available to the program and cost. So again, this really does go to the reasonableness of the accommodations to be provided. That's a key word in the Act and in the Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act, as well as Section 1557. It's about reasonable accommodations. They're not asking you to go to an extent of something that's impractical to provide those services if you're having. We'll discuss this further. I know Heidi touches on this a bunch in her slides. So it's just important to keep in mind that really is a balancing act, and looking at these 4 factors is an important first step to determining what your obligations are. So again, yeah, program and circumstance dependent. The greater the contact with limited English proficiency persons, the greater the obligation to provide those language resources. As a covered entity, it's important to determine the 15 most spoken languages in your state and area and ensure that you are providing notice of LEP policy in these languages. Again, these are just a brief overview. We're going to discuss these more in depth, but it's important that you're keeping in mind that it's not just one language. It's not just Spanish as being the language that needs to be looked out for, or Spanish speakers looked out for. It's a host of 15 other languages, so 14 other languages that need to be looked at and taken into account. And actually, CMS has some resources that are helpful in working through that. In addition, individual entities with 15 plus employees must appoint a Section 1557 coordinator to coordinate compliance, including training, policies, and procedures, as well as document of grievances with this program. So there are a lot of obligations. It's more laying out all the framework to work within and the steps needed. So entity must provide notices of availability of language assistance services and how to access those services. Importantly, I don't think we included that in that wording, it's free services. You cannot expect these patients to pay for language services on their own and out of pocket. Again, they're seeking healthcare, and that is viewed, especially in the federal funding space, as something that these individuals may be entitled to receive. So in order to make sure that you are providing adequate healthcare and efficient healthcare that the government is paying for, we just need to provide those services off the bat without charging them. And it's important that the language services provided meet a level of qualification, which means there's a demonstrated proficiency in speaking and understanding both spoken English and at least one other language, that they can interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, including of any necessarily specialized vocabulary. I'm not sure if anyone out there speaks another language or is bilingual, trilingual, but as you know, languages can be weird, even English in context, where one thing might mean something in one context, but another in another context. So it's really important to have that full grasp of the language and the context in which it's spoken. And there's generally accepted practices for interpreters as well as an ethics principle. So yeah, just make sure that when you do enlist the support of an interpreter or translator, you're making sure that they are qualified, because otherwise you might run the risk of hiring someone who really is just playing it up like they know what's going on, but maybe they don't. And if you don't speak the language yourself, it's hard for you to step in and know. So it's a very trusting relationship to want to make sure they're qualified. And
All right, I guess I'll jump in here now and delve into these factors a little bit in more depth. Did you have something you wanted to add, Gunnar?
Oh, no. If you want to take it away, I don't know if you want me to take the beginning of factor one, or it's all you.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead. Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit more in depth into the factors that Gunnar mentioned on a prior slide. And one of the first factors is the number and proportion of limited English proficiency. There, got that word out. Individuals who are eligible to be served or likely to be encountered. And in looking at this, you're looking at your service area, which includes any person who is in the geographic area that the federal agency has approved as being the area where the government-funded services are to be performed. That's a mouthful, but essentially it's where the patients reside and are provided services. Now, CMS has put out this list, and we'll get into that in a bit, of 15 languages that are spoken in each state. But Texas is a really large state, and so we need to look at the geographic area a little bit more carefully. Again, CMS has put out that, in theory, these 15 languages are spoken throughout the state, but we all know that somebody who lives in Amarillo is highly unlikely to receive services from a home health care or hospice agency down in McAllen. And so for the purposes, even though CMS has put out these 15 languages, you probably do need to look at who is an LEP person in your area. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, being Texas, we have a large number of Spanish speakers, and this state, more than any other state, has the greatest number of Spanish speakers who speak English, quote unquote, less than well. Obviously, this is greatest along the border, but even across the state, we have significant populations who speak Spanish, and therefore, excuse me, you should be prepared to address Spanish as one of the languages that you're needing to provide language services for. Next slide, please. But Texas is big. Texas is diverse. And here is what CMS has said are the 15 top languages across Texas. I will admit a little bit of surprise on some of these. I happen to have lived in Amarillo for a number of years, so I was not surprised to see Laotian on the list. There is a very large population, there is a population of Hmong refugees up in Amarillo, and so clearly the Laotian language or languages is very important up there. But you might not have a whole lot of Laotian refugees down in McAllen. So you need to, again, kind of take this as a basis, this 15 languages, and then tailor it for your area. Some of the languages are no surprise: Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, Arabic, Urdu, Tagalog. I will say I was a little surprised to see Persian, German on the list. Russian is there. There's a very large Russian population up here in the DFW area. But again, some of these other languages are a little bit of a surprise. Next slide, please. As said, the languages are not consistent from region to region, and you have a bunch of resources to determine the most commonly spoken primary languages in your particular region. So there are things here like the U.S. Census, the Migration Policy Institute, and there is an lep.gov site where we've done this here. Another thing you may want to look at is your local school district. The school district typically have statistics on what languages are spoken in your area, spoken at home, and you can use that as well to tailor which specific languages might be in your region. Definitely look at the top 15, but I think, you know, again, if you're in McAllen and you don't have a specific or a very large population of people from Laos, then maybe you can substitute another language. So the CMS 15 top languages across Texas, I think, are a place to start. But then use these other resources to determine the languages in your area. Next slide, please. So the next factor is the frequency with which LEP individuals come into contact with your agency. And obviously, the more frequent the contact you have with a particular language group, the more important it is that you have these language assistance services in that language. Again, this kind of gets to the geography question a little bit, you know, or if your agency specializes. It may be that your agency specializes or the employees are of a particular language. So you want to, or ethnicity or nationality, so you maybe want to include those individuals with that language in the materials and the languages that you need to have things translated into. So again, obviously, if you're contacting LEP individuals daily, you have a greater duty. If you rarely deal with them, then there's less of a duty. And for example, here, again, this ties in with geography. If you are in, let's say, Far East Texas, you may rarely come into contact with somebody who is a Russian speaker. So that obviously weights down Russian a little bit less in the importance of Russian as being a language that you need to have your materials into and that you need to provide services into. Next slide, please. So the third factor is the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service. And the factor here is obviously the greater the importance of the services being rendered, the greater is the need for LEP services. And what they look to here is whether denied or delayed access to services or information could have a serious or life-threatening implication for the individual. So obviously, if you're in a hospital, it is pretty important because if you need consents prior to surgery or you're working in the emergency department, then clearly delayed access to services because of a language barrier is going to have a serious or life-threatening implication. If you're in a home health and hospice, probably not quite as critical as, let's say, some of the inpatient services and venues, but you need to think about it as well. You know, at some point, denied or delayed access is going to have some serious implications for the LEP individual. And again, because we're talking about healthcare, that's sort of the other part of this factor that raises up the importance of the need for LEP services, as opposed to, I don't know, renewing your driver's license, right? Again, because delayed healthcare of any kind can have a serious or life-threatening implication for the individual. Next slide, please. So again, what we look at is we look at kind of a couple of different things. We look at sort of the immediate need, and that's often oral interpretation. And then we look at things that are a little bit, where the timing can be a little bit more flexible. So in the home, and that would be written documents. So in the home health and hospice context, we're looking at things like admissions documents, election of hospice care documents, advanced directives, and so on. These have to be provided in the language that the patient or their representative can understand. And again, what that means is looking back to the top 15 languages and determining whether or not you have individuals of those 15 languages who come into contact with your agency. So again, looking at the list and knowing the population of Texas, you should almost certainly have Spanish documents available for admissions, electives, advanced directives, etc. Now, whether or not you need them in, let's say, German or Gujarati is another question. You don't have to have them immediately available in most cases, but you have to be able to access them. So the best practice really is that you have these prepared in the likely event that you are going to need them, and that way you have them ready to go, because the last thing you want to be doing is scrambling to translate documents into a language, because now you've got a delayed access potentially to healthcare, which could have a serious impact on somebody's health. Now, be aware that emergencies can and do happen. You may have a serious event with a patient, like a fall. And in those cases, obviously, if you don't have some of these written documents available, you're going to need to have oral translation or oral interpretation services available. So you need to make sure you figure out in advance how to get these language resources and have them available. And this is especially the case if you are aware that you have a patient among your patient population who has limited English proficiency. Next slide, please. The other factor is the resources available to the provider of the costs. So the government does attempt to be somewhat understanding of the limitations of being a smaller provider. And obviously, if you are a smaller provider, you have a smaller budget, and there is less of an expectation that you provide the full scope of language services. If you are a larger entity, obviously, you are more expected to provide services. One thing I want to mention here is just because you're a small agency with a small budget doesn't mean you can discriminate. So the government, in the language of this NPRM, actually made very clear that if you're covered, and of course, if you're a home health agency or a hospice agency, unless you take only private insurance, you are covered. But they wanted to emphasize that even smaller agencies and entities may not discriminate in healthcare programs and activities, even if you have a smaller budget and even if some of these factors come into play. I think that has the effect of muddying this a little bit, but I do think that there is a distinction between not discriminating and between having to provide all of these different things. So this is something when you are going through your assessment of exactly what you need to provide, you should probably document, hey, we're a small agency, we have a census of, 30, our annual budget is such and thus, our annual revenues are, this, And for these reasons, we haven't gone the full route on implementing a full language access program. Next slide, please. So again, even if you are a small agency and you take lesser steps, the steps still have to be reasonable. Again, a language service may not be reasonable if the cost substantially outweighs the benefits, but this is again where you need to be documenting what your population of LEP individuals is. And you need to, or you can explore other cost-effective means to deliver competent and accurate language services. Now, if you're in an area that has many LEP individuals, such as some of the bigger cities in particular or particular regions, then obviously having an LEP program in place is going to outweigh the cost of the procedures or getting an LEP program. This, again, is going to require you to document what you are doing to demonstrate that a cost is greater than the benefit. So look at this and make sure you're documenting this as you're trying to determine the full scope of your LEP program. Next slide, please. So some of the cost-effective resources can be telephonic or online interpreters. There are actually free apps and the online things like Google Translate, iTranslate, or Microsoft Translator. I am going to say here, beware, be careful with using some of these free apps and online services. And that is because, again, you are going to be in a specialized field with specialized terminology. My experiences with Google Translate is it gets close. It gets actually pretty good, it gets pretty close, but it is not always right on. So you want to make sure that you do have a backup. And there are telephonic and online interpreters available where you can provide at least oral interpretation in particular circumstances. Next slide, please. So again, the two primary means of providing language services are going to be your written translation of documents, and you can do that in advance, and oral interpretation. And again, under oral interpretation, I'm going to include signing for those individuals who are deaf. Each of these comes with its own set of considerations. So if you're investing in written translation, again, you want to make sure you are using a reputable firm to do this, and you want to very carefully double check the translations and so on. If you're doing written translation, the premium is going to be on accuracy because you have time to do this. Oral interpretation, on the other hand, has to happen on the fly. So you need to be, if you're using oral interpretation, again, you need to have somebody who has the skill set to quickly and accurately translate, and they have to very quickly and be knowledgeable about specialized medical terminology. So those are some of the considerations you have in dealing with providing language services. One key thing is that all translation or interpretation services have to be what the government terms effective, accurate, and impartial. Well, we know how to determine accurate and impartial. Effective is a little bit of a squishy concept by the government, but basically an effective translation is that the individual who is receiving the services understands what is happening, can give informed consent, and really just doesn't have a whole lot of questions about what the healthcare is that is being provided to them. Next slide, please. So for an effective written implementation plan, again, you need to be looking at your vital documents. And this is any document that is critical to ensure meaningful access by LEP individuals. So examples are going to be consent forms, again, complaint forms, advanced directives, notices of eligibility, notices informing LEP individuals of free language assistance, and the notice of non-discrimination. I'm sure many of you who have insurance through one of the large insurance companies, health insurance, you get this annual notice, and it has in 15 different languages, which you'll see a little bit later on. You know, you may get language assistance services in this language, and here's how you contact that. Government payer forms are another example of vital records that you might need to have translated. Non-vital records are things like enrollment handbooks without vital information, menus, advertising, and general program information. Another example here might be a website. That's not necessarily vital information unless you have something like how to contact us again to obtain language assistance. Next slide, please. So there is a safe harbor for written translation. You're presumed to comply with the written translation requirement if you provide written translations of these vital documents for each eligible language group that constitutes 5% of the population, or 1,000 individuals in the area that are likely to be served or encountered, and whichever is less, either 5% or 1,000. Other documents, of course, can be translated orally. And here's the other thing: if there are fewer than 50 individuals in a language group that reaches the 5% trigger in the point above, you don't have to translate all of the written materials, but you have to provide the written notice in the primary language of that group that they can receive competent oral interpretation of those written materials free of cost. So again, you have to be able, let's say you have 49 Laotians, and they equal 8% of your language group. So in that case, you don't have to translate the materials into Laotian, but you do have to provide them notice that they can get an oral interpretation of these documents free of charge. Next slide, please. The other thing is that you have to post in your significant publications or communications the non-discrimination notices in English, as well as the taglines in at least the top 15 languages in the state. So again, these are the taglines that you typically see on those annual insurance notices. Another way to do this, if you have patients coming into your offices frequently, which most people don't in hospice and home health, is you can post this in your office, or you can make this available on your website or some other document that you give the individual at the start of services, knowing that they can get these services in their language. Next slide, please. So CMS, again, has posted resources for these 15 top languages. These are the 15 top languages in Texas, but make sure, again, you have double checked for your area. And what the government will eventually be doing, and they've started doing this, is they've started creating translated documents. So for example, here you see on the right, they've done the notice of non-discrimination and the statement of non-discrimination and the tagline, and they have translated those already into the various languages. The government has said that they will be translating additional documents and posting them on the website. Stay tuned and be aware that that is coming. Next slide. So again, in oral interpretation, as we said, there are some important things here. Let's be clear what we're talking about. Oral interpretation is the act of listening to someone in one language and verbally translating it into another language. Translators aren't, or interpreters are not always required, but in many instances they may be necessary, particularly if you have conducting an examination, You need to obtain patient information such as upon admission, and providing effective bedside services, especially in the social worker and spiritual counseling in the hospice setting. Again, there are some different kinds of effective resources. You have apps, beware of those. You can hire bilingual staff. Again, if you do that, make sure that your staff really knows all the specialized terminology. If you're large enough, you can hire staff interpreters. What we find is that many people actually contract for accredited interpreters. And that's real simple, that when you have somebody coming in with a particular language that you don't have somebody internally for, you just dial a number and they get an accredited interpreter online who can then interpret for the individual. You may also use community volunteers if that's the case. But again, with community volunteers, make sure that they have the specialized knowledge that you need to provide those services. Next slide. One question that always comes up is, can we use family members as interpreters? Well, maybe. They can be a great resource, but you have many drawbacks that may ultimately require you to provide the LEP individual with language services other than those offered by a family member. And one thing you should remember is you may never use a child to provide LEP services. So anybody under 18 cannot be a family member to be used as an interpreter. Now, obviously, if there's an emergency situation, a child is better than nothing, but you need to document what the emergency situation is and why you could not access any other language services to assist that family member. So a couple of circumstances where you really want to make sure that the patient is receiving independent language resources, where you have suspected neglect or abuse. And again, this can crop up in the home health and hospice space, where you find an abused or neglected child or adult. And of course, if you see domestic violence, you really want to get independent language resources there, because you don't want the abuser to be the one translating because they have a vested interest in a particular outcome. Also, if the family member is incompetent, and incompetent is viewed in a couple of different ways. So for example, somebody who is terribly distraught might not be temporarily competent to translate. So you want to think about that. Just be aware of what the circumstances are with the family member. Incompetence could also be the lack of the specific terminology and vocabulary to be able to interpret what is going on. So again, the greater the complexity and the need for complicated medical instructions, then the higher the importance of having a fully competent interpreter, and the more important that it is that you have other resources besides family members to be available to translate. Next slide. Gunnar, enforcement.
All righty, so enforcement, well, thank you, Heidi. That was an awesome sort of unpacking of a lot of information there. That's really important for people on the call to hear, so thank you for that. So enforcement, I sort of briefly talked about it in the beginning. The Section 1557 created a mechanism by which the Office of Civil Rights at HHS, and as well as states' own local departments of health, are able to review and seek the review of various healthcare providers receiving federal funds in their administration of healthcare. They ultimately like to seek voluntary compliance through compliance reviews, education, compliance guidance on implementation of constructive LEP plans, as well as just providing numerous resources for providers to implement a constructive LEP program. As I noted before, the ACA Section 1557 permits individuals themselves to bring a civil cause of action against a provider who violates this title and subsequently who violates the Civil Rights Act, Title VI. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if compliance, again, as I said, there's an emphasis on voluntary compliance and making sure that they don't want to basically throw the book at you or slap you on the wrist. They really want to make sure that you're adopting a program that fits for you and is a program that you feel comfortable with, while also making sure that individuals who have limited English proficiency are able to obtain the healthcare in an efficient and humble and effective way. So if you do not comply, they ultimately will either, as like a case of last resort and ultimate punishment, they will terminate you as a provider of government-funded healthcare services and refuse you to reapply and re-enter into that sphere. So that's a pretty steep cost, especially in the home health and hospice area, where the single greatest payer is Medicare. So if you're not able to receive Medicare funds or other government-funded healthcare, it's pretty tough to stay afloat. So it's really important that you are complying with these LEP provisions and making sure that you're providing those LEP individuals with appropriate resources and programs. And also, they can refer you to the Department of Justice with the recommendation to bring proceedings to enforce any rights of the United States, which would be making you adopt new LEP programs and essentially tailoring their own LEP programs for you. So basically cutting you out of the picture and saying this is the plan that you're going to adopt. It could be far more expensive than you wanted to spend or would have had to spend if you had just developed that plan yourself. But ultimately, when it's the DOJ mandating you do something and it's your ability to provide federally funded healthcare is on the line, you sort of have to comply with that. So it's best to head it off at the pass and make sure you're in compliance from the get-go. There are some examples of some providers and large-scale healthcare companies, some medical school universities, or medical colleges, hospitals who have actually been found to be out of compliance and as a result have had to enter into resolution agreements with the OCR. So that is their preferred method. They want you to, again, like I had said, the resolution agreements, that's a mutual come to the table, let's discuss how we can make sure that you have a plan in place that works for you and also works for your patients. So there was a Catholic charity that was providing home health and family services, and they had to enter into resolution agreement with the OCR after receiving a complaint, after the OCR received a complaint from a patient who felt that the language barriers were hindering their access to care. And the OCR launched an investigation, which they're allowed to do. They pulled all of the compliance records, pulled the programs, and ultimately they were forced to adopt a language assistance policy that provided interpreter services, written and oral language services, and in order to keep costs down, they recruited interpreters from the community to serve when appropriate. So that's a good case where they weren't forced to spend an exorbitant amount of money to reach compliance, but in some situations, that was the case. I'm going to go to the next slide.
And I just want to make a note on that slide real quick. Again, notice the different languages. It was Somali, Vietnamese, and Cambodian in the state of Maine. So you need to be, again, very cognizant of what the populations are in your geographic region.
Yes, absolutely. And these other examples will also have other different languages that were languages that you wouldn't typically see at the top of a top 15 languages spoken, but nonetheless, they were found to not provide those services, and they needed to, even though it wasn't very commonly spoken, which is the case with this California Medical Center. They resolved a complaint under Title VI, and as a result, and it was for actually not providing Karen-speaking immigrants from Burma. That's a language within Burma, it's Karen, and they were not providing those language services to their patients. And as a result, they began issuing medical cards to indicate patients' primary languages. They're posting signages indicating that interpreter services are available free of charge, and this was in Karen, the language that was most commonly spoken in their specific geographic area, county. And they also had to contract with video and telephone interpreter services to provide that over-the-air language interpretation. So that is just a few examples, but again, there's numerous things to be taken from these examples and different methods that you can implement yourself, such as issuing medical cards to patients whose primary language is not English, so that there is no concern when you go to see a patient what language they speak, and what services you need to have on hand for that patient in case things become emergent or there is an immediate need for some interpreter. So I don't know, Heidi,
All right. Yep. So, so this is, we call this looking forward, but this is in essence sort of your compliance, what you need to do to implement an LEP program, also called the Language Access Plan. So the first step is obviously identifying these individuals who are going to need the assistance. Again, this is going to be important because it goes to determining the number of individuals who require assistance, which of course is going to impact the factors in determining whether or not something is reasonable. And again, utilize the resources that we posted, you know, not just CMS, but there are a variety of other resources. And again, a great resource is your local school district or school districts. If you cover more than one school district, they really can help you identify what are going to be your top 15 languages. And again, once you have at least a good handle on what those languages are, you can use language cards to prompt an individual to share what language they speak. And language cards are available on the Department of Justice's website or at the lep.gov website. Again, just a way to help you figure out who you need to provide services to. Then you've got to identify which of your materials fall into the category of vital records. We identified many of those earlier, but there may be additional ones that you have for your particular agency or your particular services. Then number 3, you need to figure out what measures you're going to implement for language assistance. And this is informing patients on the ways in which your language assistance will be available. So again, the top 15 languages, the taglines, CMS has made those available already. Utilize those. And if you have other languages, again, it's quite likely that CMS has come up with taglines for those already beyond the 15 that are for Texas. So again, let's say you've got, I don't know, a Haitian Creole population, right? Because you're in southeastern Texas and you have, you know, a lot of people coming from Haiti. I don't know. Make sure you look at all the different other languages that CMS has on their website, and they've developed the taglines for those already. And again, have little cards prepared and be ready so that you can hand out to patients so that they know that they can reach out to you. You need to let your individual employees as well know about the availability of language services, and how to obtain those for patients, and how to respond to LEP callers, and how to respond to LEP communications in writing. Next slide. You obviously, again, want to be training your staff, and this may be different training for different individuals. So these are the staff that may initially encounter an LEP person, and then your staff that actually provide LEP services. And again, those staff may be the same people, they may be different people, but you need to, again, be aware that they have all of the training about what the requirements are and how individuals can access that. And again, if they're actually providing services, make sure they have the accurate terminology. On the right-hand side, here is an example of some of the taglines or a card that you can hand out. It's from a company called Language Line. Not endorsing them, this is just an example of this. So this is a good way, again, of number 5, providing notices to LEP persons with taglines, vital records, and again, if you have locations, you may want to include those as well. You should probably have a document drawn up for your staff that if you think anybody has language issues out in public, that they can hand that to the family members as you're admitting the patient to your services. And then you want to monitor and update your LEP plan. So the regulations, as you saw earlier, are very subject to change, but we also have lots of trends in refugee resettlement, so be aware of that. Again, Amarillo, I happen to know, has a large Hmong population, which is a Laotian population, because the U.S. Department, I guess of State, created a refugee resettlement program and brought a number of Hmong refugees, I don't know, 20 years ago, to Amarillo of all places. So those are things that you want to be aware of, you know, where refugees are coming from, what is happening in the world, because this is going to affect how your LEP plan is. And this is something that if you're large enough, employers with 15 employees, more than 15 employees are required to have a Section 1557 coordinator or coordinators. This is something that your Section 1557 coordinator is responsible for handling. Next slide. These are, again, just some additional resources to help you achieve compliance with all of this. There's a ton of resources out on the internet. Go ahead and use these. And like with anything in terms of compliance, you know, the most important thing is that you start doing something, because doing something is better than doing nothing. And as Gunnar noted on the enforcement slide, you know, the government is in fact enforcing these requirements. And I think that's it for our presentation. I see we're a minute or so over, but I think we may have time for questions if individuals want to pose some questions.
Yeah, I think we already had one question for you guys, if you guys are ready.
Yep.
Vanessa asked, if the provider agency is using the advanced directives forms made available by HHS, who has the responsibility of having those forms translated into another language besides Spanish? Because I think I'm assuming they have them translated in Spanish.
Yeah, so eventually, hopefully, CMS will do some of the work and will provide documents out on their website. But at this point, if there is nothing out on CMS or a state website or generally available, it is the responsibility of the provider and therefore the cost of the provider to translate these documents. Yes, folks, another unfunded government mandate.
But there are a lot of resources out there. You might be able to find some versions of those HSS directives, advanced directive versions, on the internet somewhere. I know some providers make it available to the public, so it's definitely worth a Google search.
Exactly.
Providers helping providers kind of thing. Alrighty. Well, that makes sense. Well, thank you guys so much. That's the only question that you guys could really answer. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers, Gunnar and Heidi. And everyone from today's webinar will receive copies of the presentation slides via email. If you have any questions about today's discussion or another healthcare law issue, please feel free to reach out to Lyles Parker. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Stay warm and dry.